and welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Garjuk with UATV. Numerous human rights violations in Russian-annexed Crimea are one of the hottest topics for discussion in the whole world right now. The European Parliament has repeatedly called on Kremlin to stop violating the rights of the population on the annexed peninsula. This time, the European officials went further and adopted a resolution condemning human rights violations in Crimea. To have a more detailed talk on the issue, we are joined in the studio today by Tanya from Human Rights Watch in Ukraine. Hello and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, could you tell us more details about the resolution?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this resolution is once again an important tool that the European Union has in terms of calling out Russia on its violations of the laws of occupation of human rights law in Crimea, and flagging those particular egregious violations that are committed especially against the Crimean Tatar community in Crimea and other independent critics.
Who is mentioned in this resolution?
Well, the cases that are mentioned specifically are the unfair trials and guilty verdicts on bogus charges of separatism and extremism against Crimean Tatar leaders Akhtem Chagos and Almi Umerov, as well as the journalist Mykola Semena. But the resolution also mentions the concern about harsh verdicts against a score of other Crimean Tatar members and also other critics that were peacefully opposing Russia's occupation in Crimea.
How many people in total became the victims of these political repressions in Crimea?
Well, I mean, it's hard to count because the human rights crackdown in Crimea happened at the very beginning of the occupation and happened really, really fast. So as you know, thousands of people left Crimea because the cost of staying on the peninsula and continuing life as they, were used to it was just too high for many people. I was there with a colleague in April of this year, and we just realized how repressive and how difficult life has become in Crimea.
Well, as far as I remember, Rafat Chubarov mentioned the number of 48 people, like the official number. Do you know, are they mentioned in this resolution also?
I think that they are mentioned, yes. There are like scores of other cases that European Parliament paid attention to.
Well, and in this document, the European Parliament proposes to enhance sanctions against the Russian Federation, right?
Exactly. It actually calls for sanctions against those people who are involved in perpetrating human rights violations in Crimea. And what's interesting that it also included those who were involved in the persecution of Almi Umerov, Ahmet Chagos, and others.
Mm-hmm. But there was another similar resolution adopted last March, and within half a year since then, did anything change in Crimea?
Well, it's a good question because, the resolution of the European Parliament essentially cannot directly force Russian Federation to respect the rule of law and its obligations under the occupation law and the international law. I wish it could. It would be an ideal world, but the reality is that it's the other situation. What it can do specifically is to influence policy developments in the EU nations. So, for example, many strategies were developed as a result of this that called for a consistent and united approach to dealing with Russia, and also flagging these violations that Russian authorities in Crimea are committing consistently and over and over again means that these issues will be included in how EU as a whole and individual EU member states deal with Russia, and calls on them, of course, to include these issues and continue to urge Russian Federation and the Russian authorities in Crimea to address human rights violations that I mentioned in this, for example, specific resolution.
Yeah, but in Crimea, since March, nothing changed in Crimea, according to human rights
Well, like I said, we were there in April, and what we documented and observed is that it's extremely hard for people who stayed to talk about the situation because the cost is too high. I mean, let's look at the people that the resolution mentions. For example, Admir Umerov, he is punished by prison sentence for an interview to a media outlet where he says that what he believes in, that his homeland should not be occupied. It's a peaceful but very, very vocal expression of what he believes in and what he cares about. He should not be persecuted for saying something that is his opinion. Imagine, and he's a leader of Crimean Tatar community, and imagine just a person in every just an ordinary person trying to, for example, complain about things like healthcare or access to employment. I mean, again, what we documented in April is that people are scared, and it's really the price for speaking out has become too high for people to continue voicing their opinion.
Is there any logic for these people to seek justice in some international courts, maybe?
Well, that's actually another item of this resolution by the European Parliament, where they specifically encourage the European Court of Human Rights to prioritize considering the cases that come from Crimean residents because of this, specific situation where they cannot even hope for justice and redress in Crimea from Crimean and Russian authorities there.
Is there any reaction, or what reaction would you expect from Russian Federation towards these new, the latest resolution?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the leadership of the Russian Federation has become extremely cynical when it comes to respect for human rights and respect for its own international human rights obligations. It's a situation that we continuously observe in Russia since Vladimir Putin came to power in late 90s, and we are talking right now about a situation which we have not seen a worse human rights situation in this country since the breakup of the Soviet Union. So I think, unfortunately, we'll be, like I said, cynical and probably indifferent, but that is not the only, not the only element in this process. Like I said, this resolution will influence the policy developments, foreign policy of EU in its member states, and that's what it's important.
Well, I hope that the international community will create enough pressure for Russia to liberate political prisoners in Crimea and throughout the Federation. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
That was Tanya Cooper from Human Rights Watch in Ukraine. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Goodbye.